residents are encouraged to labor the plants until the storm has passed.
Good evening and welcome to the Resident Small Show. My name is Ken Gillette. You might recognize me. I did the Ralph Records 10th anniversary radio special, and I've also been featured on Kojak a couple of times. I have been hired, thank you. I've been hired by the residents to come out here and kind of explain the show to you superficially as it goes along. I've been armed for this task with a script, which I have right here, and I've also seen all the rehearsals and all of the shows to date. Now, first of all, and most important, the gentlemen that were out here with the eyeball heads and are now standing back there behind the instruments are the residents, right back there. Okay, the first tune we heard this evening was entitled Voices of the Air. As far as I can make out, one of the residents talks about the weather all the way through it. It's not important to the plot. That was followed by The Secret Seed, where a bunch of dancers came out and ran around with flashlights on their hands. It says in the script that that was supposed to show us how moles have sex or something. It didn't look like sex to me either, but then again, we're not moles. Well, that's it for right now. I'll be right over here watching along with you and back out again when we're lost. was kind of flashy in a low-tech sort of way. But how many of you have any idea what's going on in the plot at this point? Okay, well, I'll do my best to help you out. First of all, over here we had God of Darkness. That was just religious garbage, wasn't important at all. That was followed by Working Down Below, in which we must learn that the moles work down below and seem to enjoy it. We then had First Warning, with the lights going back and forth to get your attention. Then they lulled you back to sleep with Return to Normality, with a little Flintstones cradle going back and forth. And that last thing with the strobe lights and the cardboard things being thrust at you was called The Sky Falls, and now the mole's homeland has been destroyed. Coming up next is another religious number, so we can all take a little rest. Go ahead. Now actually, between now and the intermission, the next 4 or 5 songs, it gets very interesting, but it goes by fairly quickly. So let me tell you what is going to happen. The mole's homeland having been destroyed, we're going to see them crawl out from underground, head across the desert toward the sea. They'll go by some weird old man, and finally they will be led, presumably, to the promised land. Now this is a part that I feel very strongly about because it takes a lot to lose your home. When I was a kid, my parents' house burned down while we were away, and I got back there and my parents were very upset, and I thought it was cool because, you know, they interviewed me on television and I got to see it and stuff. But, you know, I was just a kid, you know, but I felt sorry for my dad because my dad used to take the bus to work, and after we moved to the new house, he'd always get on the wrong bus, you know, and he'd have to get off and get on a different bus again. And what I'm tying this in with is what you're about to see is just like 1 million moles, all on the wrong bus, and all very confused. You watch. the residents have another moment or two of setup, and while they're doing that, I have a theory on the residents that I'd like to share with you. I believe that there is only one resident, and that he controls the other three, just like he controls all the rest of us. Let me show you what I mean.
Don't be excited, just me. Other residents.
Actually, that had nothing at all to do with the residents. I just wanted to show you that I really could do something. And I also need fire, but I've been very sick lately, and I thought if I did it, I might get more sick, so I'm not going to do it. And I've also written some comedy shows and stuff, and I was a judge of the Ringling Brothers, so I can do more than just in this show. Thank you.
bien, ça fait.
Stamp your lips, snap your teeth, and we're back. The moles have left their land, and now they're about to enter an entirely new land. And the new land looks like this, has a lot more color, and this is the land of the chubs. This little fellow here is a chub, and you're going to be seeing a lot of these chubs. And they are going to welcome the moles with open little chubby arms. But the reason they're going to welcome them is not because they want to help the moles out, but rather because they can use the cheap labor. They're going to exploit the moles, that's their idea. And I've always had this thing about fairness. I believe that fair is fair, and in this case, the moles had no choice. They had to leave. They did not want to leave their land. They'd come to the chubs' land, and I don't mind the chubs putting them to work. They should work, they should earn their keep, but the chubs are exploiting them. There's a difference, and this is where fair is not fair, is because of the attitude of the chubs. Okay, you get the idea. Fair is not fair to start. sorry, that's all we need. Sorry, that's all we need. This is the kind of attitude I expected from the Chubs from the very beginning. I don't care how useless you are. I don't care how ugly you are. I don't care how unnecessary you are. You don't need to be told you're not necessary. No one needs to be told you're not needed. And the Chubs have no right to treat the moles that way. And I want to say something else, and that is about my part in this show. It seems like it's pretty unnecessary. And I think it is very necessary. And it seems like if someone's going to talk about the show, the least they could do is be able to speak French. And I can't speak French, and I should be able to. I didn't do well in high school in it. And I'll tell you why I'm here. I'll tell you why I'm out here. I'm out here because the residents gave me a plane ticket from Los Angeles, California, over to here. They pay me weekly. They pay my per diem. And work is not that easy to get, so I take it where I can. And I'm traveling on the bus with these four guys, and you aren't. Thank you very much. So.
On l'a payé pour présenter, qu'il se pouvait préparer les morceaux, il ne savait pas parler français. Conneries comme ça.
this backdrop is called the War Machine. It is not the right backdrop. We played the United States. The Chubs and the Mullahs had a cultural exchange. It was a very interesting ending. They said if we were going to come to Europe, we needed a flashier ending, and some agent or promoter type person got the idea for this piece of shit, which is the War Machine, the real snappy ending. You're supposed to eat up this shit, this vacuum cleaner with fire coming out of it, right? And this is the kind of shit. Okay. You want the microphone? Take the microphone, put up your asshole, huh?
Ça n'a rien à voir ici. Ah oui. Reste en bas et puis il ne va pas exister. Faites quoi, Paris aussi?
You didn't make enough of an asshole of me, did you? I'm not enough of an asshole. Stick a microphone in my mouth, I'm more of an asshole. Listen, you guys, put me on a fucking airplane, I'll be on your goddamn hair. I don't need to be fucking humiliated by full fucking so-called avant-garde government file asshole. You look like fuckhead. Shit. Get up.
It's our show! You messed up our show!
C'est lui qui fait les voix.
All I wanted to know is picture beauty! You know it's picture beauty! All I wanted to know is who were the jobs and who were the moles? Who were the jobs and who were the moles? Who were the jobs? Oh, I can sing so hard. You get confused. Everybody gets confused. Sometime or another. And you too, yeah. You get confused. I just have to. You just have to keep doing what you're doing. And hope that somewhere you get satisfaction. Everybody wants a little satisfaction.
Bonjour, I can get no satisfaction.